Okay, well, then let's begin. Hello, everybody. It's very strange starting one of these kinds of events because, of course, I can't see everybody in the audience, but I can see that there's 32 people who have signed in already, which is really great. I'm pleased that there's so much interest in the subject, and it's good to have all of you with us, even though we can't see you directly. My name is Brian Lucas. I'm the manager of the Governance and Social Development Resource Center, the GSDRC. And this is the sixth in a series of public events that we're organizing for the UK Department for International Development. This event is part of DFID's professional development activities for its own staff, along with a series of reading packs, e-learning courses, and other publications. And this event will be recorded and made available on the website after the event for people to look at later. Reducing poverty, of course, has always been one of the principal objectives of international development. Goal 1 of the Sustainable Development Goals now is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And the first target under that goal focuses on what's called extreme poverty, measured in this case by the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. But everybody working in development, I think there is a general agreement that poverty is more complex than simply income and expenditure. There's increasing acceptance that poverty is multidimensional and that we need to think about people's lives in a more holistic way. Think about education and health, inequality, individual happiness, social inclusion, the ability to participate fully in society. And our presenters today are going to help us unpack some of these kinds of issues. What do we mean by poverty and well-being? How do we measure them? How do we try and eliminate the one and improve the other? And are the tools that we're using right now up to the job of doing that? Our first presenter will be Andrew Shepherd, Director of the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network at the Overseas Development Institute. He was previously the Director of the Chronic Poverty Research Center from 2000 to 2011 and has published a number of books and journal articles on poverty reduction and rural development. Sarah White is a professor of international development and well-being at the University of Bath. She researches the tensions between local experience and global policy, with an emphasis on culture and social identity. And she does a lot of research in South Asia, and from 2010 to 14, she directed a large ESRC DFID study on well-being and poverty pathways in Zambia and India. And we're also pleased to welcome Ana Paula de O Campos from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, who will serve as a discussant in today's presentations. Ana Paula is an economist and policy analyst in gender, agriculture, and social protection, and is strategic program advisor for the FAO's strategic objective on reducing rural poverty. So Andrew and Sarah will each give short opening presentations, about 15 minutes long, drawing on the reading packs that they have prepared for DFID. And then we've asked Ana Paula to follow up with a short response to their presentations. And then we'll invite questions from the audience. You can type your questions in the chat box that you should be able to see on your screen. And we'll wrap up at the latest an hour and a half from now, 3:30 UK time. So I'd like then to give the floor to our first presenter, Andrew Shepherd.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to I'm going to spend a little bit of time today relating what's in the reading pack to various things that I'm currently working on. So I won't be reflecting directly on the reading pack. And the first thing I have to do is to find the PowerPoint for you. Is that visible?
Not yet, Andrew. If you go to the left-hand side of your screen and click share screen.
Okay.
Or screen share, I think it says.
I'll have to go through that process again, do I? Sorry about this. I'm afraid, Isabel, it's not coming out for me.
Hold on, let's try it again. So you still have the PowerPoint open?
The PowerPoint open there, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe if we go back to screen share. And then it should have come up as one of the options to select.
This is time. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Technical hitch over. Sorry about that.
There always has to be one at least.
There always has to be one. Let's hope it's the only one. Okay. Yes, I mean, I think these issues have gone up the agenda. That was the first point that I tried to make, and I'll just give you three little indicators of that. Recently, I've been asked to, well, a team of us at ODI have been asked to do quite a major piece of work for the European Commission, which wants to review all its work in relation to the current knowledge about poverty and poverty eradication. So we're doing quite a big piece of work for them, looking at the situation out there across developing countries, looking at whether the country categories that are used, like low-income countries and so on, are useful, any insights on causes, and also we're doing some work on policy preparedness as part of that. So that's one. Second one is that I was contacted by UNDESA, which is the kind of secretariat, the Economic and Social Secretariat in the Secretary General's office. And every year they write a World Social Situation report. It's not a very high profile report, but they wanted to know whether this year they should do something on chronic poverty or on extreme poverty and chronic poverty. So there was a second one. And then colleagues in ODI have also been working on the Leave No One Behind agenda, which is part of the SDGs. You know, we're working on looking at what the policy priorities should be under that agenda going forwards. So at least at the international level, there's lots of, if I was going to be rude, I would call it froth, but if I was going to be polite, I would call it interest and concern and activity going on. At the national level, I suppose I would have a question about what has changed with the coming of the SDGs, but we can assume that over the next 3 to 5 years there will be lots of activity in many developing countries around the priorities of the SDGs. Okay, the second point, and you know, poverty lines is something that you know, is kind of core to all this discussion. They're very difficult, and you know, they tend to be quite arbitrary in many ways. There are lots of different poverty lines, which is very confusing. There are income poverty lines. There are now multi-dimensional poverty indices, and so on. It's a very tricky issue. I think the world uses income or consumption or expenditure poverty, and I don't think that is going to change for all its limitations and faults. The multidimensional approach to looking at deprivation poverty is a good complement to that, and I guess the two will run in parallel, and that's a big improvement. I often feel with multidimensional, thinking about multidimensional poverty, that what is interesting is the relationship between the different components of the multidimensional index that you're using. Sometimes I also feel that these indices mix apples and pears, so perhaps the index is less useful than actually looking at the components. Our particular concern working on chronic poverty is with poverty dynamics, and there we look at movements around a poverty line. And the problem there is that there's a lot of movement around any given poverty line, and it's called churning. What do you do about this? If you want to say that somebody has escaped poverty, well, they may have escaped poverty only to fall back in again, you know, because they're very close to the poverty line, and it's not a very significant movement. And a lot of poverty dynamics captures that. So in some work that we're doing at the moment, looking at what we've called sustained escapes from extreme poverty. So this is looking at people who manage to get far from the poverty line or stay out of poverty once they've escaped. And what are the factors involved in that? We've started to explore using a band around the poverty line to exclude at least some of that churning, so that we, you know, when we look at poverty dynamics, we get at real movements. And I think it also helps to make, you know, any individual poverty line a little bit less arbitrary. When we started work on chronic poverty back in the early 2000s, and we produced the first chronic poverty report in 2004, we had a very strong supposition that chronic poverty was highly multidimensional, so that there ought to be a really good correlation between multidimensional deprivation and chronic poverty. Well, empirical research has actually showed that these connections are not at all simple, and you can have progress in one dimension which is not reflected in another dimension. I don't know. I mean, I think you know, we haven't got to the end of that story at all, and I think there's scope for some new work there. I suppose a working hypothesis would be that if you're severely multidimensionally poor, that is to say you're poor in 5 out of the 10 indicators that the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative use for their index, you're quite likely to be chronically poor. It's a working hypothesis. Watch this space. I mean, I guess there'll be work coming out on that. Now I have to move down there. Yeah. I forgot to mention actually this first slide, which was, I mentioned a report that we're doing for the European Commission on poverty, and what we have found there is that if you take what we've called disadvantaged categories of developing countries, so low-income countries, in this case compared to upper middle income countries, least developed countries compared to non-least developed countries, landlocked developing countries compared to non-landlocked developing countries, fragile and conflict affected countries compared to non-fragile and conflict affected, and sub-Saharan Africa compared with East Asia and the Pacific. And if you look at trends since 1990 through to about 2011, and you weight for population, you actually find a divergence across most of those groups. So in other words, the more disadvantaged groups haven't converged with the less disadvantaged groups of countries. They've diverged if you weight for population. If you don't weight for population, if you do it country by country, then there is a little bit of convergence. So I think that's quite an important, you know, thinking about the future and where to put aid and where to focus efforts at poverty reduction. That's quite an important aspect, and I'm quite happy to talk about more similar sort of any other sort of comparisons that people want to ask about. We've done a fairly extensive analysis of the data. Okay, coming back to the third point, which is about growth. And yes, I mean, of course, economic growth is extremely important in poverty reduction. I mean, some enthusiasts believe that it accounts for 80% of poverty reduction. Well, I don't know. I think one of the things that is increasingly thought is that the level of inequality has a considerable impact on the extent to which growth translates into poverty reduction. Interesting finding from our recent work is that low-income countries are less unequal, and that may be the reason that growth works better for poverty reduction in those countries compared to richer countries. I think richer countries have to work much harder in policy terms to get growth to translate into poverty reduction. The other issue that came up though with growth in our recent analysis was that the volatility of growth is really important. It's one thing getting growth going, but it's another sustaining it, and sustaining it in a way that is sort of reasonably consistent from year to year is very tricky. And this slide doesn't tell you anything about macro level growth, which I was just talking about, but it tells you something about micro level growth. And it's from a life history of a Bangladeshi man. And you can see there that his upwards progress away from the poverty line is always being challenged by events, which may be personal events or environmental events or others. ill health and that kind of thing. And I think there you can see that, you know, the volatility that is often there at the macro level is also extremely important at the micro level. Just a footnote: we work with panel data, so that's data, household survey data, tracking individuals across time, but also with life histories, and we try and, in the best work that we do on these issues, we on poverty dynamics, we try and combine the two. We're now working, in terms of work on growth, we're now working with the idea of pro-poorest economic growth. So growth that includes the bottom 10% or 20% of a society, and includes them hopefully on better terms than they've been included so far. What we've done is to identify countries where there have been episodes of pro-poorest growth, and then to do some comparative work across those countries. I'm just putting up a slide with growth incidence curves for Vietnam at different periods of time, which show you the percentiles of the population. So the richest people are on the right-hand side, the poorest people are on the left-hand side, and you can see that the fortunes of the poorest 10 and 20% of the population are quite different at different times. There's a slight cautionary note here, which is that the growth percentages are different in the three different charts on the left-hand side. So don't be misled by that. But I think you can see that the shape of the graph is different over the three periods, and the fortunes of the poorest people are also somewhat different. And in the first graph, the first period, it looks like growth was pretty much in favor of the poorest people. And in the second period, rather less so, except perhaps right at the bottom. And in the third period also. However, in the third period, although, you know, relatively speaking, it doesn't look so good for the poorest people in terms of their income growth. But in absolute terms, you know, their incomes are growing at 6.5, 7, 7.5, 8%, which is pretty good, really. So, you know, you have to look at the absolute changes as well as the relative changes going on here. There's a reference to magic bullets, and I think you know, through the last several decades, there've been one magic bullet after another. It used to be integrated rural development programs, then it became microfinance, and I think more recently, it's been social protection. And I suppose the reading pack was implicitly cautioning against magic bullets. But if you look at microfinance, it's the financial sector and poverty reduction. It's a really important sector, not to deny its importance. However, when we began to research what benefits the poorest people in terms of financial sector development, it was pretty clear that what they need is opportunities to save. They need insurance. If you can link social protection payments with financial access, that's a pretty good thing. And there's tremendous potential in the linkage of payments with mobile phones. So you know, credit didn't come out as #1 priority. I mean, that's not going to be news to many of you. Social protection. I think oh yes, I'm on the right slide. That's good. Social protection is very good in the form that in the form of cash transfers that has been widely practiced in developing countries in the last 15 years. Very good, I think, for addressing chronic poverty. Perhaps slightly less good at stopping impoverishment, largely because it's been targeted at people who are under the poverty line. So if you, as we argued in the last chronic poverty report, if you want to get to zero poverty, you need to stop impoverishment as well as tackling chronic poverty, and of course sustain escapes from poverty too. So preventing impoverishment would require a much more insurance-based approach and strong protections in other areas: disaster risk management, conflict prevention, universal healthcare, perhaps universal healthcare in particular. I just wanted to go on and show you how important and anyone who's followed the chronic poverty reports may recognize this slide, but this is a slide looking at the extent to which falling into poverty can equal, exceed, or be slightly less than the rate of escaping from poverty. This is monetary poverty, and this is using, I think this was using national poverty lines, if I remember rightly. So you can see there that there are quite a few countries where the grey bars, the people who fall into poverty, are higher than the yellow bars. And of course, this may be different at different points in time, and from one survey to another, but it does indicate that there's quite a problem around stopping impoverishment. More broadly, the policies that we drew attention to in the Chronic Poverty Report, we tried to identify common policies which would achieve all three objectives, which were social protection, education, very good at stopping impoverishment, interestingly, as well as tackling chronic poverty. A bundle of context-specific measures on pro-poorest growth, and various other issues would deal with all three objectives. And then there were some specific policy areas that were particular to one of those three objectives. I'm just going to talk briefly now about a couple of other things that are in the reading pack. So employment, which is a really core issue, both focusing on the quantity of employment that can be generated as well as the quality. The instruments, the policy instruments to do either of these things are quite limited in many cases. For the poorest people, casual wages is an absolutely key indicator. And we know now that these have been rising in Asia in particular. But monitoring wages is something that very few governments do very effectively. And I think it's an area where the potential of real-time information based on networks of mobile phone users is really quite significant. Measures to push up casual wages include a minimum wage, although minimum wages are not they're generally confined to the formal sector. They can have knock-on effects into the informal economy, and you can also target specific occupational groups. So a number of countries have had significant success with minimum wages for domestic workers, for example. Social protection is again something that helps to push up wages, sometimes quite explicitly when you have employment guarantee schemes or widespread public work schemes. Constraining the labour supply in the long term through education, through family planning programs, and freeing up labour markets. These are the sort of things that that will make an impact, often over the long term, but in the case of social protection and minimum wages, also significantly in the short term. And then, improving the quality of self-employment is also incredibly important. I'm aware that I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit fast through the rest of the presentation. Coming to gender equality, we are just in the process of compiling a database of policies in the 31 countries with more than 5 million extremely poor people. We've had a reasonable go at about 26 of these countries so far. The others are quite difficult to find data on policies, at least through the internet, so we're going to have to go through a more exhaustive process for those. But in the 26 countries, gender equality is well represented in terms of policies. So the policies are there, but this database also looks at the quality of implementation, and it also looks at whether the policies are evaluated. And in the case of gender equality, they're rarely strongly implemented, even in relatively wealthier developing countries, and they're quite rarely also evaluated. So I think that there are lots of difficult issues there. Gender equality is incredibly important in a number of respects for the poorest people, or moves towards gender equality. Lots of very difficult issues around social norms and so on. But the overall finding, I have to say, was given the attention that has been given to promoting gender equality over the last 20 years, in particular, the finding was quite disappointing. I think I probably ought to wrap up now because time has moved on. I'm just going to go quickly to some of the projections that we've done recently, which is a little bit like going back to the beginning of the, sorry, that we haven't done, but have been done recently, to the beginning of the presentation and looking at different categories of countries and making progress and so on. It's very clear from the mainstream projections, at least, that there's going to be a concentration of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa in 2030. However, you have to qualify this by saying that changes in patterns of growth, changes in patterns of inequality can make a very big difference. And you know, so that picture could be quite varied depending on what happens between now and then. And we know already that growth forecasts are being revised downwards. So you know, the picture could look quite different. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we've lost Sarah. Her computer crashed, and I understand she's logging in on another computer at the moment. So we should have her back to give her presentation in a moment. I wonder if, in the meantime, we could. Anna Paula, maybe I can give the floor to you for a minute or two. Do you have any comments or reactions to or questions for Andrew?
Sure. Well, first of all, it was a very interesting presentation. I think it highlights this global concern that we have in the sense of how we measure poverty at the moment, and you know, once again, this need of conceiving poverty as a multidimensional issue. And I think it's very important to keep asking this question and demanding that we have alternative poverty measures, right? Because having a poverty indicator that is not only related to income, to consumption, for example, could also highlight other aspects of poverty that we also need to tackle with our policies and programs. It was interesting to see that the chronic poverty report also find that the chronic poor are left behind, because this is something that Rebellion has also found in recent studies by him, is that while you know we've made enormous progress in reducing poverty, we still see that the poorest of the poor have remained poor, and that the consumption floor hasn't really raised up in the last 20 years. So this is something that I think will link into Sarah's presentation later on. Why is that? Are we focusing too much on consumption, for example? So that was one of the points that I think it was important to highlight. Then Andrew also mentioned that economic growth is obviously necessary, but it's not enough. We have to pay attention also on other, let's say, in the enabling environment, let's say on education, in access to employment, for example. The question that I have is probably think about how to make it happen, right? Because if you could think of the, I mean, probably three determinants of making, for example, development more coherent across sectors, what would this be, you know? And I can think of examples, for example, of Brazil, of China, no? Like in Brazil, in China, for example, when they started all their reforms important reforms, particularly in the agricultural sector. They have a very good enabling environment, education, for example, and health were accessible to all, and that enabled them to pass certain reforms where the poorest could benefit from the start. Whereas Brazil, when they also undertook a series of reforms in the 90s to tackle poverty, they have this issue of inequality, right? So that's what led Brazil to look into not only poverty growth could bring the poorest of the poor out of poverty, and they have to focus on social protection policies. No, so all in all, of course, this is an example of that economic growth helps, but it's not enough. And in countries such as Brazil, other measures should be taken into consideration, such as social protection. I was just wondering if there could be other examples that either Sarah or Andrew or the audience could also mention around this issue. Well, finally, the point of social protection is very relevant. Of course, we should warn that this is not a magic bullet, and in fact, of course, social protection sometimes equals to cash transfers, and we shouldn't necessarily see it in this way. I think, of course, cash transfers have been very successful. We've seen it in Latin America. We've also seen it in Africa. But if we compare these two, for example, these two contexts, we run into the issues of making, for example, cash transfers or public works programs, for example, viable. I think in the case of Latin America, it was successful to a certain extent because there were institutions were somewhat stronger, let's say at the decentralized level. And although in Africa there's decentralization is also strong, there are other issues that haven't enabled probably the same level of impact. And added to that is also the fact that the question around countries, for example, Latin America, most of these cash transfers are funded by their own governments, whereas usually in Sub-Saharan Africa, we still see that these programs depend on major international aid funding. So what can we do basically to foster the social protection programs in countries where this is still not the case? Because there's a high risk there when countries cannot support their own social protection programs, and of course we don't want to. While these are important and should continue, we should also try to find ways in which countries have experienced some growth, share some of that growth or direct some of that growth to social protection. This would be my 3 points. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we have Sarah now. You have your computer working again?
Are you talking to me?
Oh, yes, yes. Are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah. Are you ready to pick up with your presentation? Sorry, we lost you there for a moment, but I guess your computer crashed.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, you'll only be able to hear me, I'm afraid. I've had to switch computers, and the presentation is on the other one, so I shall just have to talk. And you can imagine beautiful slides of Zambia in the background, which will be considerably nicer to look at than I am. Yeah, I'm very sorry about that, the computer bother. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about well-being, picking up on some of the introduction that I made in the reading pack, but really focusing it in a more practical way, because the reading pack was quite theoretical, trying to give a kind of sense of the range of ways that well-being is understood in development. And I thought, well, let's get a bit more practical and think, well, what difference does it actually make? The so what question that academics love to hide from. And of course, there are many potential applications of well-being in development. It's such a broad concept. But I thought I would concentrate just on two that are kind of at the extremes of the spectrum. So on the one hand, there is a quantitative measure, a relatively straightforward, perhaps, measure in which you're asking people their subjective perceptions about what's happened for them. And the great value of that is the idea that you can get a direct sense of impact. You know, what has the project meant for the people involved, or what has the program actually, what difference has it made to people? Not just has it achieved what it set itself out to achieve, but has it actually made a difference? And that's, of course, what development wants to do. Impact is one of the current buzzwords that we're all dealing with and seeking to demonstrate in different ways, whether as academics or as development practitioners. So to have a new approach which claims to be able to deliver that, and deliver that quite directly in terms of people's own perceptions. So you're bringing together that impact word with also that sort of populist idea of people themselves telling us about it. So it's a very powerful mix. So I thought, well, let's talk about that and what are the issues with using subjective measures of impact, and also quite at the other kind of end of things, to say, well, what are the politics of well-being, or what might be a positive way to involve well-being analysis in a situation where really politics is what is holding development back. And that, as we know, is very often the situation, probably more often than not. So I thought I would just talk at sort of two ends of the spectrum. One, the quite specific and immediate, in a sense, quantitative end, and the other, the broader end of politics and looking at a whole situation. And in talking about the immediate, the use of wellbeing in policy, I have to say that I'm drawing very much on a partnership that we had at the University of Bath with Tradecraft. It's a fair trade organisation based in Gateshead, but with projects all over the world. And we worked with them on wellbeing indicators and the use of wellbeing indicators in their monitoring and evaluation framework. And hopefully they learned a few things from us, but we certainly learned a great number of things from them. So I'm drawing on that experience in talking to you now. So of course, one of the key issues that all attempts to trace impact face is the question of attribution. So we can see that some sort of change has happened, but can we say that that change is due to the project or the program that we developed? And this is a particularly difficult question for wellbeing indicators, because since wellbeing questions are usually quite personal, there are all sorts of things that can go on that can affect how people are feeling at the particular time that you ask them, or in a more general way in terms of their lives. And many of those things are actually quite personal. So they are about the quality of relationships, how things are going in terms of their immediate kind of microecology, or about how they are doing individually or as a household economically, which may be much broader than the particular program you've got. So there are real issues, and I think that has to be acknowledged. And we need to be quite skeptical, I would say, of people who say you can simply go and ask how happy people are and then use that as a measure of how effective your program has been, because there are just an awful lot of intervening variables. So I suppose my sort of general point about the quantitative, the use of quantitative measures of subjective well-being is to use with care. Yes, that would sort of sum up my view on it. So that's one question. The issue of attribution is quite tricky. It's not impossible, but I think it's very difficult if you use quantitative measures alone. You really need to talk with people and see whether they trace how they're feeling to the program, and obviously do that in ways that allows them, that doesn't just lead them to tell you what you want to hear. There were then a number of questions that came up, particularly from Tradecraft, about asking personal questions. So well-being is quite personal. Is it right to ask about personal issues? And particularly, is it right to ask about a broad range of issues that in the end you know you can't deal with, you can't be working on? Are you going to raise people's expectations by asking them about their lives in the round, whereas in fact you know your intervention is going to be a particular part of life but not the whole of it? So there are sort of practical issues about that. And I think those practical issues are quite strongly felt at the ground level as well. So you can have a chief executive level, people are really excited by the idea of well-being, it's something new, and we know how development always likes new things. But then at the practical level, people who have to implement the programs, there can often be a lot of questions which are about raising expectations and also about encouraging people to think about possibilities that in the end you're not going to be able to deliver on it. Is it even cost effective to spend time with people in that way? There also clearly are issues about putting numbers on subjective feelings. And I think we've all got kind of, in the West, we've got very socialized into thinking that this is a sensible thing to do, even though all of us, well, many of us anyway, feel a bit queasy when we're asked to give a single answer to how happy we are with our lives. And we have a sense of that being a very arbitrary thing to be asked. But nevertheless, we do it. And the fact that we do it, we've been kind of schooled into thinking that this is a sensible thing to do. In a way, it justifies then the whole industry of subjective well-being measures. What you find when you go to more places where people have not been schooled in the same way, the places where maybe education is at a lower level or not the same type of education as we're used to, is that people aren't used to answering those kinds of questions. And quite reasonably then, they question whether those are sensible questions to ask. So it's actually cognitively quite a complex thing to be asked about the whole of your life, and then so you generalize, you abstract from the specifics, the level at which your life is lived, and then you give a single kind of number or maybe a set of numbers about how you're feeling about different parts of your lives. So the question of whether that is a sensible thing to do, I think we do need to keep in mind and not just assume that it is. Just because people can do it doesn't mean it makes a lot of sense to do it, and certainly doesn't mean that it makes a lot of sense to put a lot of weight on it in terms of measuring development effectiveness. One of the other things you find when you talk to people kind of out in the sticks is that they understand questions differently. So a classic well-being question, subjective well-being question, is how satisfied are you with your life? And in general, the higher score, I'm very satisfied with my life, is thought to be good, indicating positive, a positive sense of well-being. But what a number of people have found in studies, particularly in Southern Africa, is that when they were asked that question, people who had been very positive about their lives up to that point said, well, no, I'm not satisfied at all. I mean, there's a whole lot more, all sorts of things that I still want to achieve. So how can I say that I'm satisfied? So they were interpreting that question in a very different way, and in a quite opposite way to the way that we assume. And in fact, those people who said that they were more satisfied were ones with whom the interview as a whole had been rather downbeat. So yeah, I don't have much expectation of anything better. Yeah, I guess I'm satisfied. So we need to be quite careful and not assume that these questions mean the same things or are understood in the same way in different places. Another side of it, and I'm seeing this increasingly, so there are a number of academic papers. There are obviously huge numbers of papers on subjective well-being itself, but there are an increasing number on subjective well-being in development context. And one of the anxieties I have, and I'll come clean on this, I'm a qualitative researcher rather than a quantitative one, so I have my strong biases that have to be borne in mind. Although I have been doing mixed method research, so I try and take the numbers more seriously than I might have done once. But one of the concerns that I have is that once you have subjective numbers and you think that it makes sense to have a "how happy are you" sort of question and to fix that with a number, you also then want to put numbers onto all sorts of other qualitative aspects of life. So, for example, you want to start assigning numbers to conservative social norms. One place is categorized as having conservative social norms, and another place is categorized as not having conservative social norms. So there's a danger, I think, that once we think that we can put numbers on people's feelings of happiness as well, we also get more emboldened to put numbers on other areas of life which are similarly really difficult to quantify and similarly very complex and have quite a sophisticated understanding to capture them well. So the numbers and the placing of numbers on the subjective, things that are essentially subjective, and aspects of life which are essentially qualitative, I think we really need to be very cautious about. And many people disagree with me, but in my view, what we need in development is not more quantitative measures. I think what we need in development much more is a much greater appreciation of the qualitative aspects of life, and particularly of the politics of how of what people can get and why in different situations. So the paradox, I think, is that the idea of well-being seems to be bringing in the social, it seems to be bringing in a kind of whole-of-life approach, but it may be being used, at least by some people, and sometimes unconsciously, because it just fits into a sort of existing toolbox that people have. It may be being used actually to sort of sideline the social and sideline a social analysis of a situation, rather than actually broaden and make more comprehensive our understanding of what's going on in people's lives. Another side of well-being that people talk about a lot is adaptation. So a bit like the issue about how satisfied are you with your life, the argument is that people adapt to what they experience. So your expectations are a reflection. Your expectations are a reflection of your experience. Not in the sense of everybody has the same expectations and then they measure their experience against it, but rather that if you are chronically poor, for example, you're unlikely to have the same set of expectations as you might if you'd been born as a member of the elite. So your level of satisfaction may be the same, but simply because you really have very low expectations of your life. So that is a real question as well. So the danger is that then it becomes a very conservative measure. Yes, the poor are happy, as we know. They smile every time when we go out to see them. So that's fine then. So again, you know, there's a need for quite to move beyond these very sort of simplistic approaches that, in a way, well-being, it can lead itself into. I don't think it needs to go there, but there's the danger of it being co-opted in those kinds of directions. And the last one is a kind of techie point, but I think it actually deserves more attention than it gets. And that is that these measures, the subjective measures, are always fixed end scales. That is, so you've got, you know, whether it's a measure of 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, whatever it is, you can't go more than whatever the end is. So if this year you were pretty happy, you said you were 7, and if next year you're even happier, you say you're 9, if the following year you're ecstatic, you've really got nowhere much to go. So what those fixed end scales do is they keep people within a certain range. They fix things within a certain range. So, for example, the famous comparison of how happy people are plotted against GDP is quite an odd thing to do when you think about it, because GDP is a kind of real, I say kind of, I am a sociologist, but it is a kind of real measure, and it can potentially go up and up and up forever. But your happiness can't. Your happiness is always going to be in this kind of measure plotted on a 1 to 10 scale. So you've got two very different things being put against each other and people arguing about what that means, but not really questioning whether it makes sense to do that kind of thing, whether they're actually just very different types of measures that shouldn't be put alongside each other. I see I'm chattering on too excitedly and going on too long, so I shall move. So that was a set of cautions really about the numbers, the number side of subjective well-being. Not to say it's not ever useful. I think it can be useful, but it's a quick and dirty measure, and it has a lot of problems with it. So to be cautious. The other situation I wanted to talk to you about was from the research that Brian mentioned in the introduction to the seminar, and I want to talk about the Zambia side of the research. So we were doing research in a place called Chiawa, which is on the edge of a national park. And in a sense, what you had there was a kind of classic modernization in imagery. You had large agribusiness plantations feeding the nation. You had very high-end luxury safari tourism and marketing thereby of wilderness. And on the other hand, you had a complete disconnect from those to your classic rural African people living in houses made out of mud bricks and with very low technology or no technology really, agriculture through which they were making a living. So a classic disconnect, a classic kind of modernization tradition, modernity tradition sort of divide in a way that appeared. But of course, when we look more closely, what we found is that those two sides of the situation weren't separate at all, but were very closely linked. So that the development that had gone on, and it was development as we know and love it, had actually undermined people's local livelihoods. So some people had done well out of it. Some people had got jobs in the safari lodges. Some men had got jobs in the safari lodges. But overall, there were all sorts of problems associated with it. So the land on which people were living had been taken for the plantations. The best land had been annexed by safari lodges going along the river. Large numbers of animals, elephants, hippos, and so on, were roaming in the area because of the way that land had been annexed. They were actually coming closer and closer to the villages, so there was a great deal of conflict and fear and damage to lives and livelihoods from the confrontation with animals that took place. The wildlife authority, which was there to look after the animals but also to manage the relationship between people and animals, was widely felt by people themselves to be protecting the animals against the people. And the combined effects of all this were really disastrous. In 2012, in our second round of fieldwork, we found that 70% of our respondents had planted maize, which was the main crop, but only 37% had harvested any. That is, a half of the people who had planted maize hadn't managed to harvest anything through a combination of drought and damage from animals. So in this situation, doing a well-being analysis, then there were a whole lot of areas that we could look at. Clearly there was the economic, which is fundamental, and there's no getting away from the economic being fundamental when it comes to development contexts. But alongside that, there was a general sense of insecurity, fear of the animals, and uncertainty around livelihoods, and the underlying sense of land being lost and the threat of land being lost. I can't go into it now, but to do with the way that the land titling worked, and people who had long-term settled on the land but didn't have any formal titles to the land and weren't in a position to gain formal titles to the land, and therefore were in danger of having the land on which they were farming taken from them. So the politics of land was very much an issue, and as you can imagine, it was a very tense issue with a lot of tension between the people who were in authority and the local people who were concerned about their own situations. In that context, for us to have gone in, for example, to talk about land rights would have been simply impossible. It would have been seen as incendiary. It would have been seen as too political. We wouldn't have got the authorities' agreement to go. To go in and talk about well-being, which is a much softer, apparently non-political kind of issue, brings a very different response. Who could be against well-being? So not only did it allow us to look, for example, at sort of fear and the psychosocial side of things, as well as the economic and the political, but also it allowed us in a way to go under the radar and thereby to raise the politics of well-being and to recognize that, yes, development has happened, but the well-being of local people has been undermined. So it gives you a different kind of register, if you like, a different kind of language which you can talk about the interests of local people. Not denying that there is development, because agro industry, it is a form of development, and clearly tourism is also a form of development. So not to deny that, but nevertheless to bring forward that well-being issue. I think I'm probably out of time, so I should stop there, but I can go on more if anybody wants me to at some point later.
Thank you. I was having a great time imagining that scene, that forest scene that you were describing there.
Well, hopefully the slides can be shared later on.
Yes, I think we have copies, and they'll be emailed to everybody who registered. Yeah. Anna Paula, could I ask you to maybe just a minute or two to comment on what Sarah's talking about regarding well-being?
Yeah.
Also, I could maybe while you're doing that, sorry, everybody in the audience, please, if you would like to use the chat window on the side of your screen to type questions that you would like to ask to any of our presenters, please go ahead while Anna Paula is speaking.
Okay, well, I'll be quick because we're running out of time, but I think it's Sarah's presentation is very interesting and highlights the importance of giving more weight to other measures of development that is not only income or consumption or economic development. However, there are challenges for doing this. I was maybe wondering as I was listening to Sarah's presentation if there are other ways. What are the different ways of measuring well-being that exists? I've heard the question, are you dissatisfied with your life? But are there any other ways of asking about well-being, other methodologies out there? It reminds me a little bit of that, I think the Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. Of course, this was meant not to inform a program, the impacts of a program in particular, but it tried to look at those issues more at a national level. And also Thailand had its own Green and Happiness Index, which was released, I think, in 2007. So have these indices worked, and how have these been used to inform the kind of policies for development? I think it would be a good way of comparing Sarah's work and reflecting on more national measures, no? Because in a way they've tried to quantify these things. The issues raised by Sarah, which are, I think I can resonate to those. These issues about whether asking questions about well-being are too personal, and in some contexts this is not. People aren't necessarily used to talk about these questions. Sometimes when we go to the field and ask these questions directly to people, we realize that people not necessarily think or question themselves about this, no? So there's also this issue about how much this is coming from our own culture as well, no? Of asking about well-being, and what are the other ways of inquiring about well-being that is closer to the way they ask themselves about how satisfied or happy they are about their lives, no? Particularly among the extreme poor, we find oftentimes that self-esteem is very low, and I was just wondering how much that could also be a challenge for really trying to capture these issues, given the fact that, as I said, people don't necessarily question themselves about this. They just accept it as a given. No? So I think that's I could see also there some potential for empowering people to think about these issues also, if in determined context. No. Well, I can resonate if I just comment. Of course, all the different issues about adaptation to different context. You know, these issues of understanding questions differently in different contexts are very resonate a lot to the work that has been done to try to measure women's empowerment, for example. No. And for this, you know, and FAO has done a little bit of work with the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which is trying to quantify how much women are empowered. And the work we've done in FAO has been trying to adapt this WEA index in the context of social protection to evaluate the impacts of cash transfers, public works programs on women's empowerment. And our take on that has been that the qualitative is very relevant for this in this context, no? Because we were not always able to disentangle what we're collecting basically in a quantitative survey, and the qualitative has been, I think, the core of the research, where then gives some life to the quantitative data that we collect in terms of different domains of empowerment. So that will be my last, and then I'll let the others talk.
I want to sort of add to one of the questions that Ana Paula just asked to you, Sarah. Ana Paula asked, what are the impact of the different ways, like Bhutan and Thailand and these places have tried to have an impact on policy? And I was interested in that too, from the point of view of kind of research communication, which we do try and do at the GSDRC. How do you make these very personal stories relevant and useful and impactful on policymakers who tend very much to work in a very quantitative fashion? How do you scale up these personal stories to things that they can plug into national budgets?
Yeah, lots of issues there. I think on the policymaker front, we need to be a little bit cautious of the story that it's all about the numbers. My sense of it is that stories are actually pretty important in terms of motivating people to take action. Mm-hmm. People remember stories, and numbers, as we know, can be found to support the policy that people want to do. So I think that numbers are important, that numbers undoubtedly have a power, and people are impressed with them. But I wouldn't undermine or undervalue the importance of stories too. What we did in terms of our research communication actually was going back to Zambia when we had worked on some of the findings anyway. And we went together to visit sort of various policy organizations, the World Bank and so on, and we went together with 2 elders from the village so that we could kind of get through the door in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do. But once we could get them through the door, they could speak with a power that we couldn't speak with because of their own experience, direct experience of what had been going on. And that was it was a great experience to be able to enable that to happen, and to be able to listen to those men speaking from their experience direct to policymakers. I think it was very powerful. And the World Bank were directly involved in that area. So, you know, don't underestimate the power of the personal, I would say. In terms of the growth of national happiness, I must admit I'm a bit of a skeptic, but I'm also not terribly well informed. I think what is interesting is the way that, although it, most of the kind of talk about it is about the happiness measures, in many ways what they've come to now is a pretty standard set of development. It's a development measure, really, with a few sort of happiness measures thrown in. And I think that that's what tends to happen. So that even when you start with a very kind of skinny subjective well-being measure, you tend to bring in a whole lot of other development measures too. And like Andrew was saying, actually, I think that often they are apples and oranges, and often it's a bit questionable when they're brought together into indices, and you're better just keeping the separate things there. So personally, I am doubtful whether aggregating subjective well-being to a national level makes any kind of sense at all. But that's just me. I think once you've lost the ability to see the people, because you've just gone up to that sort of scale, then talking about subjectively how people are feeling about their lives is, I don't know. I'm not quite sure that that's a sensible thing to do. I suspect it makes more sense when you, at a kind of lower level, where people, where you can have a sense of what their context is out of which people are speaking. In terms of different measures, there are all sorts of different ways, of course, that you can ask about well-being. There are some participatory approaches, and we actually produced a book in 2014 with Practical Action, so working together with different NGOs who have worked up different kinds of participatory measures that they use to assess well-being and quality of life. So that's, the idea of that book was not to say these are perfect measures, but rather these are kind of tools that you might want to use and you might want to adapt for your own purposes. So there are certainly quite a few things out there. I think part of what the early motivation for working on well-being was, certainly with our original project in Bath, Wellbeing in Developing Countries project, which started in 2002, it was about really questioning what we think we know about the poor. So do the poor necessarily have low self-esteem, even people who are very poor? I don't know. I mean, I think that's a question. We tend to have, we tend to kind of represent poverty, and poverty is obviously a very bad thing, but we also tend to sort of package it up in a bit of a stigmatized package of everything is wrong with people's lives. And of course, poor people, just like the rest of us, they're happy or they're sad, and they have good relationships or they have crap relationships, and there's all the fullness of life is there for them as for us. So I think one of the values of well-being is actually to try to pull apart that kind of composite sort of everything is negative view that we have about people living with poverty, and being able to actually see their life in a bit more variegated, a bit more sort of, the colours of it rather than the monochrome that we tend to represent our pictures of poverty within.
Andrew, I wonder if I could pick up on one of the questions that Anna Paula also had in relation to your presentation, which was about social protection. You talked about the very, very great importance of social protection in helping to reduce poverty. And Anna Paula asked a couple of questions about what form of social protection. We, cash transfers are very common tool being used these days. Are they the most effective tools, or are there other tools that should be used? And how do we support social protection in countries that lack the resources to implement social protection programs on their own? What's the best way to kind of support these sorts of things?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, social protection. I mean, I think that there are different tools, and even when you're talking about cash transfers, there are very different ways of doing these things. And I would say, as a kind of rule of thumb, that there's no right way. that very much depends on the political discourse within different national contexts. So it may be that in order to justify a social protection scheme, that something is required from the people benefiting from that social protection program. So it may be that they have to meet various conditions, so you get conditional cash transfers. Or it may be that they have to supply labor, so you get public works. So there are very different national discourses. There are also different national discourses about who should benefit. You know, who is the deserving poor. And it's not always necessarily the poorest people, and you know there are disagreements about these things. So it's a highly political process on lots of different fronts. And I would say that you know there is no perfect approach to social protection in general. These things have to be worked out in any given national context. The second part of your question about how do international agencies best support it in countries where there aren't the resources. I mean, I would say first of all that there are many countries where there are the resources to support it, but where they've not yet decided to go down that route. And in those situations, you know, maybe you can support pilot programs. You can obviously support. You can help policymakers to go to other countries and see what's happened. And there's a variety of practical things that you can do. But what you actually need is a public discussion. And the value of doing a pilot program is not the pilot program and the results that it generates, but the air that those results get in the media or among members of parliament or whatever. So I think generating a public discussion is a very valuable thing to do in countries which have not yet taken the plunge. Where you know the large number of countries that I think it's something like 44 if I remember rightly that have a total public expenditure of $500 per person or less, and there are countries where governments are spending $200 or $300 per person per head of population or less. In those countries, I think if you're going to have a national system of social protection as opposed to you know, little projects here and there run by different organizations, then you need a different international approach to the issue. You need to be able to go to the government of even Zambia, actually, which I think rejected a long-term commitment to social protection. I think it did some time ago. Maybe that's changed more recently. But you need to be able to say to the government of Zambia that we, the international community, however that's composed, will underwrite your social protection program over a period of 10 or 15 or 20 years. And we'll do it, we might want to link it with you raising domestic revenues, increasing domestic revenues over a period of time, part of which you devote to social protection, so that gradually the state takes over the expenditure. But you know, I think some kind of long-term commitment is necessary, and the international community doesn't do that. So I think there is an impasse there until the international community changes its approach. There is an attempt by the ILO to construct, is it called the Global Social Trust, which would do this kind of thing. But you know, I think by and large, international donors are very reluctant to make those sort of commitments. They think in terms of and operate in terms of 3-year cycles, and country by country. And I think this is something that you know requires a very different approach.
Okay, thanks. We've had a few questions now from the audience, so maybe we'll just take those in order. Claire Crawford asks about this problem that Sarah mentioned about the range of the scale values that you use when you're asking about the level of contentment. What experience is there using comparisons over time, comparison of now versus some point in the past, which is something that she apparently wants to experiment with. Are these kinds of measurements, are they consistent over time, or can you do measurements over time?
You certainly can, and there are a lot of people wanting to, and Tradecraft, in fact, have been doing that themselves. There are difficulties with it, though, of course, and one of the difficulties is, what are the goalposts? So if you say you have a very successful program, you might start off with people saying, well, you know, on the whole, I'm kind of okay, let's call it 3 out of 5. And then you might have a very successful program, and part of the success of your program might be to raise people's aspirations, so that instead of being happy with the income that they had when you started, they start thinking big, and they start thinking, well, you know, I don't just want to have, you know, 3 cows, I want to have 10 cows. Where am I? Well, I'm kind of still in the middle. So the paradox might be that actually the success of your program, which should enable people to improve and also thereby to raise their ambitions for themselves, might lead to a lower score than a less successful program where people had stayed with the same sort of ambitions. So what you need to do if you want to measure over time is to link the qualitative and the quantitative. So if you know, well, what were the goalposts originally? What were the things that people were thinking of when they were saying how satisfied they were with where they were at? Then you can say, okay, well, we know that those were the goalposts then, and now these are the goalposts. The goalposts have shifted. So in that context, then you can read the numbers against what they're actually indicating. But if you don't have that qualitative data to complement the quantitative, then you're really not too sure what it is that you are measuring. So again, banging the drum for the qualitative data to complement the quantitative.
That's also, Pamela asks a similar sort of question in the flavor or in the theme of banging the drum about how you maneuver through the development industry to show the value of qualitative data. I think you've actually said something very interesting about the power of stories. I think that's quite true, actually, that people react very well to stories, and they remember stories, and stories have a very big impact on people when you're using them to communicate.
I think they do, but I mean, I do very much recognise what Pamela's talking about, and we had a seminar actually in Bath in December where Karen Elliott, who's done a lot of work on wellbeing indicators in the UK context, was talking about her experience. And again, the same sort of thing, you know, as a qualitative researcher, feeling constantly being sort of wrong-footed by the fact that most of the powerful positions are occupied by people with a different disciplinary background. And I think that it's something that many of us experience, and the more we can actually recognise, it's a bit like, you know, women's consciousness raising in the 70s, recognising that what we thought was our personal problem actually is about the structures of society, or in this case the structures of the industry, and kind of sharing experience more, and trying to get out of feeling that defensiveness, and trying to get into a position where we can positively assert our own, the value of our own approaches, rather than having to sort of take pot shots at other people's, because that's, you know, that's part of it, is also having a positive message. And I think part of that positive message does involve, you know, being rigorous as qualitative researchers and having a clear sense of what that means. Because the danger also is that, what does qualitative research mean? It's very sort of vague. So, you know, if you go out and have a chat with a couple of people, you know, I talked to my taxi driver and he said, is that good enough? So I think that we also need to be clear about our methods and be clear about what is valuable in sense of qualitative data, and what is actually just anecdotal and may be indicative of something further but really needs to be researched. But I think that there is a, you know, yes, I think the time has come really to take the battle beyond the enemy lines and really to put forward the strong case for qualitative research, which I think is there to be made. And I think the more of us recognise one another and support one another as we are making it, and keep saying, where is the qualitative information, that will help. So we build the environment where there is actually a demand for it. And I think there is, even if you're going to, impact evaluation, which is so strongly quantitative in many ways, at least the way that it's been kind of rebranded recently. The people who have been doing that work do recognise that the qualitative is needed too. So I think there are real signs of hope for us to warm our hearts again.
Caitlin Scott has also another question for you, Sarah, about questions on political power or agency. Have these been tested? Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. This actually links a bit back to what was raised earlier about different measures as well. There are, of course, many different measures. In our research, we tried to develop a different kind of subjective measure. So rather than just kind of how satisfied or happy people were, we tried to get a sense of almost like a subjective capabilities measure. So what people feel and think themselves able to be and do. So in trying to develop that, we sought to find questions that made sense within the particular context and across a range of domains. And one of the domains that we had was agency and participation. So issues like, do you feel you're heard if you go to the village meeting or if you speak at the village meeting? Those kinds of questions that would make sense within a particular context and were developed within that context. And then you'd have a range of responses from, I don't even go to the village meeting, to yes, I always feel free to speak and that people listen to me. So in those kinds of things, you can get measures. I think what we found was difficult is that the kind of rules of the game for testing the validity of those kind of psychometric type measures are they value similarity amongst questions rather than difference. So if you're trying to get a range, if you want your questions to cover the range of different kind of aspects of political agency, say, you're likely to find that they don't necessarily correlate very well with one another. So people will be empowered in one area of life and not in another, as we know classically. That's not a problem if you're just sort of taking each of the questions in their own right and comparing them maybe across populations. So do men tend to answer this more positively than women do, or that sort of question. But it is a problem if you're wanting to say we've got a coherent model which we've tested statistically and we can say it hangs together. Because the models that hang together well are models which basically you've got a very similar question being asked just in slightly different ways, and that's why they work. So yeah, so mixed experience really, but certainly there's a lot to play for, I think, and having those kinds of quantitative measures does help. I mean, even helps people like me. So for example, recently in Oxford Development Studies, we've just published a paper which looks at food security actually in India, and how our well-being approach was used with both quantitative and qualitative measures to check on. So we had people saying in that context, in the particular context where we were, yes, it's great, we're not hungry anymore. 5 years ago we were hungry and now we're not. And then a range of different measures which were both these subjective measures of well-being that we developed and other measures. And more in-depth qualitative work as well to sort of see a range of the way that you can look at the same question but with a range of different approaches and see the extent to which they confirm one another. So I think there's just a lot of interesting work there, but there's some way to go, I think, in terms of getting robust quantitative measures of these kinds of issues.
Okay, we are getting close to the end, so I think what I'd like to do is ask Andrew first to if he has some any more comments to any of these questions or some comments to wrap up, and then ask Anna Paula if she could say a few words to kind of bring it to a close. Andrew, could I shift over to you? You had you wanted to respond to some of these questions as well, even though.
Okay, thank you very much, Bryce. Yeah, well, on the qualitative and quantitative, one of the things that we've tried to pursue over the last few years is to combine these methods. And I think one thing which helps policymakers on the qualitative absorb the qualitative beyond sort of the power of the individual story, if you like, is if you can do quite a large amount of qualitative work. Qualitative work is often very micro or very particular in one way or another, very focused on a particular issue, perhaps, and produces a limited number of stories. One of the things that we've found quite powerful is to be able to say, well, we've got a household survey here which has 1,000 respondents. Out of those, we've gone back to 150 households, and we've interviewed in depth 300 people. And you can then look at the quantitative results, and you can look at the qualitative results. You can compare them, and often they're quite different, and that leads to interesting discussions. There may be slightly different indicators used, and so on. And but what you can do there is then create some ideal types, what social scientists call ideal types, from the qualitative work, so that you can't say that it's representative in the same way that the survey is representative, but you can say that coming from this, you've selected these qualitative interviews in a purposive way or something. You've tried to represent a number of different situations, and you can create these ideal types. So you can create pictures which are not individuals, but are comprised of the experience of numbers of individuals, but significant numbers of individuals. And you can then talk about the causes of what you're observing. You can plausibly attribute in perhaps a slightly stronger way than you could do if you just had a very few stories that you were telling. So I think linking quantitative and qualitative in that way has considerable power when it comes to reporting to policymakers and convincing them. Just a couple of other things. Paula was asking about how do you make development more coherent across sectors. I mean, one little observation, going back to social protection, is that as countries become more sophisticated in terms of their policy development capacity, you can think about the integration of one policy area with another. So producing integrated social policy becomes a possibility, where you look at the links between health and education and social protection, and health and social protection, and so on. And beyond that, you can also think about the link between human development and social development and economic development as a policymaker. For example, one of the things that we found recently is that whereas progress on poverty is quite varied across countries, progress on human development, taking some of the standard indicators, is much less varied. So many more countries are making progress on human development than they are on consumption poverty. And one of the things that I think development has failed to do is to capitalize on that human development progress in order to enable poorer people to participate better in economic development. So, for example, how do you use the education system, which is generating your improved human development indicators, if you like, to also enable poor people to participate better in the economy? How do you link the education system better with the labour market? And that's an area which is really neglected in terms of policy making. How do you produce health services which are also good at getting people back into work when they have accidents or when they have an illness that needs treatment? So those sorts of issues, I think, and just generally trying to capitalize on human development progress for economic development would seem to be, I mean, obviously human development is very valuable in itself, but we're kind of missing a trick there. So I think making development more coherent across sectors is a really useful thing to think about. And just finally, we were talking about social protection a while back, and I forgot to say that a number of countries are commodity exporters and make a lot of money out of minerals. And those countries tend not to be very good at reducing poverty, tend not to be good at including large proportions of their population in the benefits of progress. These are countries that can afford to do social protection. So, having a big campaign with those countries and making it as political an issue as you can in those countries would be one way to go. But just to comment on Sarah's case study from Zambia, I really like the idea of having the soft approach of talking about well-being and coming out with a really hard-hitting and critical evaluation of a development process. I think that's a fascinating and really worthwhile idea there. Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, sneak in there and get in with on a track that is acceptable. Yes. Anna Paula, could I maybe ask you to have the last word?
We really are
sort of
out of time,
on,
so
yes, we're
I'll
running
try
down
to
to
be
the
quick.
end. So,
but I guess the overall main point is that, well, there's obviously a consensus on the limitations of measuring poverty as it is right now. We need to give more space for qualitative measures, although we still struggle on first making the case, and second, bring it probably at global level, like beyond the impacts that, for example, in this case, we talked about well-being of projects can have. We talked about bringing this qualitative measures more to influence, let's say, policy making in development and poverty reduction strategies. But one very good point is that people react to stories, and this can be a good way of trying to bring together the quantitative and the qualitative evidence that we have. We talked about bringing both methods more closely together, not just superficially, but maybe from the start and within all the process, and also with reporting. Well, this probably wasn't mentioned, but this is something we've done in FAO with very good results, integrating the mixed methods. And finally, we talked about social protection. How do we make it? One way of funding it or finding funding for it is in those countries where some sectors are thriving, such as mining, for example, or oil, and this can be taxed. Some taxes can be applied on those sectors to fund social protection policies and programs. Particularly if we want to make the case that countries should capitalize on their human development, right? So as economy grows, we also make sure that the countries will be able to capitalize on their human development. So I think that's what I collected of this very interesting seminar.
That's a good summary. A wide range of discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. Sarah pointed out at the beginning of this that the two presentations, Andrew's and Sarah's, were talking about quite different things, but there are, as we see, everything is all connected in development, isn't it? Thank you very much, everybody. Andrew Shepard from ODI, Sarah White from the University of Bath, and Ana Paula de O Campos from FAO. Thank you all for participating, and thank you to everyone in the audience for being with us. I guess goodbye to everyone. Thank you.